From Lighthouse Reports, this is Backlight. Every month, we take you behind the scenes of real world collaborative investigations.
We're your hosts, impact producer Tessa Pang.
And investigative reporter Beatriz Ramalho de Silva.
Hey Beatrice, how are you? Are you getting excited for Johannesburg?
Yes, I'm very excited for Johannesburg. By the time you're listening to this, I will be at the African Investigative Journalism Conference alongside a bunch of our Lighthouse colleagues. And I'll be on a panel with Thomas to speak about our biometrics reporting. And this is an investigation that we will actually be speaking about in this episode today. So I'll get into it later on in the episode. But we will be there chatting about the investigation, which we published with Bloomberg, and talking about the push for biometric technology across Africa. So, lots of exciting things. I've never been to Johannesburg, and I'm really looking forward to connecting with all the journalists there. So, that's a bit of me. How are you, Tessa?
I'm good. I'm very jealous you guys are going to Johannesburg. It sounds like you will have an amazing time. But yeah, my last few days have actually been very focused on organizing documentary screenings. We actually have a documentary we're co publishing with ARD, the German broadcaster, on our desert dumps investigation. And the documentary has some pretty harrowing footage of how EU backed border enforcement leaves migrants basically completely stranded in the desert in Tunisia, Mauritania, and also remote areas of Morocco. The documentary is being released at quite a timely moment because it's in the context of more EU deals with non EU countries to prevent migrants from coming to Europe. And the documentary will be released in English on November 9th. And we're organizing screenings in Spain, in the Netherlands, and also with some members of parliament and civil society in Brussels as well. We'll post all of that on our social media. I'm also helping to organize some screenings of our Poison PR documentary by Africa Uncensored in Kenya. And it's actually the investigation we talk about a bit later in this episode. So, yeah, I'll also get into that later.
That's really cool. And I'm really looking forward to seeing some of these in person. So, this month's episode is about how to get sources to talk. So, we're chatting to two of our colleagues about this. And first off, Tomas Statius, whose specialty at Lighthouse is building sources.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I'm an investigative reporter at Lighthouse Reports.
And Elena DeBre.
I'm a reporter in the food systems newsroom, but I've worked across newsrooms as well, including on investigation, surveillance, borders, war winners, and I joined last year as a fellow. And
Today, we're talking about two major investigations, one on biometrics that was led by Thomas, and Elena's work on the Poison PR investigation. Both of these investigations leaned really heavily on building sources, developing trust, and finding the right people to talk to. Our biometrics investigation is a three-part series looking at the false promise of biometric technology in the African continent. So, with Bloomberg, we investigated how digital IDs in Uganda, Mozambique, and Congo have failed to deliver on democratic and development promises, whilst at the same time making fortunes for tech vendors. So, Thomas led the investigation in Congo, which revealed a succession of failed and corrupt biometric deals for an ID card that never materialized. And the story has had already a massive impact. So, as a result of his reporting, Congo actually canceled its 1.2 billion ID system contract. So, that's no small feat.
Yeah, that's huge. Big congrats to the team. And the second investigation we talked to Elena about is our Poison PR investigation, which we just published late last month, actually. And it uncovered a covert campaign set up to downplay the risks of pesticides and GMOs around the world, but particularly in the global south. And part of that campaign was to profile thousands of environmentalists, food writers, scientists, and also civil society organizations who were trying to sound the alarm on the health risks of these pesticides and GMOs. And the most shocking reveal was that actually this campaign was paid for by US taxpayer money. And Elena, who we talked to in the episode, was a really key reporter on this right from the very beginning of the investigation. So, this episode will cover how to cultivate sources, techniques on how to get sources to speak, some tips for new reporters in building sources, and we'll end with a bit of a discussion on safety. Okay, let's dive into it. Okay, so we gave Tamara and Elena a call last week and we covered a bunch of issues. But first, let's talk about how you start building sources and identify the right people to talk to. So, Tamar gave us a really interesting example from his recent investigation into the failed promises of biometric systems in Congo.
The Congo investigation, contrary to some of the work we've done before that are essentially like mixed methodologies, this was like source based, There was no OSINT, no, 3D modeling, no access to databases that we had through FOIA, for instance, Nothing like that, In this piece, everything that's written, every document we had, every quote, every conclusion we were able to draw came from sources. All the documentation we refer to, everything from contracts to billing stuff to corporate filings, everything was source based.
All the reporters at Lighthouse have a kind of different area of expertise. So from open source investigators to data investigators to, as 3D modeling, as Thomas mentioned before, and source building is Thomas' area of expertise.
I often say that I do source building mainly at Lighthouse because I do not have any, technical abilities. But I think, and that's partly a joke and partly not a joke. Basically, I spend all my time on the phone or meeting people. That's essentially what I do.
We asked Thomas about how long it takes him to build his key sources, and he gave us an example of a key source that he actually built for the biometrics investigation.
When we decided to focus on DRC, I already set contact with someone who is a broker who I never met, essentially to this date. Like we talk on the phone probably every week or so. And I started texting to this guy, like asking like naive question. I had looked back at my notebook. I think the first interview we had like was quite close to Bastille Day, so around like the 14th of July, 2023.
So, for context, that's about a year before our investigation was published.
We have extended conversation that I would say were not super useful to what we were doing, partly because he did not have knowledge on, like, very first-hand knowledge on what we were investigating. And this guy kind of passed me on to someone else, saying, like, on this field, like particular field, you should like talk to this guy, right? So he gave me his phone number.
This kind of indirect approach was something that Elena also said she used during the Poison PR investigation, and she gave it a cool name. She called it the concentric circles method.
When I'm thinking about sourcing, I think about this as kind of this metaphor of concentric circles where the key source, who is at the very heart of the investigation, or that key piece of information, is at the very center, but there's this widening network of lots of other people surrounding this source, or this, sometimes the best source isn't necessarily the person at the innermost ring, since that's maybe the person with lots of power, super close to it, and they're going to be more guarded. It's going to be harder to reach them. They aren't going to be able to say as much. And we did with this poison PR investigation is we started at the very outer ring in this.
Okay, so once you spent time working your way to the right source, how do you actually get that person to talk? Because you can't just pick up the phone and ask that person for a confidential document. Thomas and Elena actually had 3 techniques they used to work up to that ultimate ask. The first is to view the relationship as a two-way partnership.
One is to see cultivating sources as cultivating a relationship. And I think one way to do that is see this as a two-way partnership where you're not just extracting information from someone or hitting them with really hard questions.
I think you have to treat this as a real relationship. This is not a utilitarian relationship. I do not call him only when I want to have infos. And I think in that aspect of it, your empathy is the most important stuff. People trust you with information that could put them in danger. So the less you can do essentially is to care a little bit about that.
And a part of building that relationship and building that trust involves a lot of conversations.
Sometimes it's going to be 30 minutes on the phone where they're talking about their pet cat, but that conversation is just as important sometimes as the hard hitting ones because it's just all about cultivating that relationship, calling them back, having multiple phone calls, texting the source without a connecting point you've made. And yeah, I mean, I think that some of these techniques are really just, deep listening and being curious and being open to having good conversation and allowing connections to unfold and finding those connection points.
The second technique is something Elena touches on right at the end, which is finding a common connection. And I found Elena's perspective on this really interesting because she's an early career journalist, and often this can be seen as a big disadvantage, especially given the gendered aspect that can be often so prevalent in journalism.
And so I think it's important to take some time before reaching out to a source to think about what a possible point of connection you can make with that source is. And with, I think no matter who the source is, there's always a point of connection to be found. And for example, with Poison PR, I found the fact that being an early career journalist was a connecting point with the people I want to talk to in this community of people were early on in their careers and also in similar communication fields. And so by opening with and being transparent about my own career path and maybe similar ambitions and questions I had on career beginnings, that was a way that kind of opened up the conversations and relationships with sources and got them more comfortable to open up and talk with me. I feel like we all carry kind of images of what it means to be a reporter, and there's maybe like stereotypes in Hollywood films of reporters like yelling into phones or having really aggressive conversations with powerful people. And, that isn't my style at all with sourcing. And, I found that I like just finding the right people and going through that task and then connecting with them. And I think just kind of understanding that you can be the reporter you want to be and play to those strengths. And even if for some, it's really just the aggressive and the hard hitting and pointed questions. And for some, it's more, the longer process of finding those connections, and all are just equally as important and meaningful.
Yeah, I really like Elena's reflections here because so often when we imagine journalists cultivating sources or having like clandestine meetings with people who have access to confidential information, we really picture a certain type of person. Usually, it's a white man who can blend in with bankers at a bar or get insider tips over a few rounds of golf at the club. Clearly, I don't really know what bankers do with their time, but I imagine it's this. But that's not, a reality or an option for everyone. So finding your own personal style and approach is so important here.
So, yeah, we see a lot of these depictions, which I think are quite far fetched. And actually, I do think, like both Toma and Elena mentioned, successful source work is really about building a rapport with your source. It's about building trust, and ultimately, it's about empathy. And when it comes to source work, you might find that actually being in a privileged position, let's say, comes in different ways. It might be like Elena puts it, that you have something in common with the source, like you're both early in your career, or maybe you are somewhere reporting where you understand the context really well and you speak the language and you spent years building sources and expertise in a field. And sometimes I think privilege can also come in other forms, like being an outsider is a great advantage too. So there's no one way. Personally, I always spend a lot of time stalking the people that I want to approach, let's say, understanding who they are, the things they've spoken about in the past, and getting a sense of the best way in to talk to them. So ultimately, I think it's always important to be really open. There's no useless conversation. Sometimes you'll spend hours talking to someone who will put you in touch with an incredibly useful source. And time is a really big thing. So that's the privilege of the work we do, and, of the place we're working in, that allows us to do that. So Thomas also spoke about this a bit. He spoke about the importance of finding common connections by showing interest in people's lives or things you have in common. And he mentions how he keeps sending these texts and these messages to his sources even outside the context of a specific investigation.
They send me pictures when they go to vacation and so on. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. So I think it has to do with the relationship you build, which is not a fake one. It's a real relationship. I often joke about the fact that I send like close to 100 texts a day.
Toma, that's really interesting. Can you give an example of the types of things you text, or like what kind of conversation do you make with someone when it's like not about work, right?
It depends, it could be like, making some jokes over the phone, to, yeah, what's up? Have you been doing lately? Like, it's been a long time. We haven't, discussed and so on, or we haven't had a coffee. That's the kind of stuff I'm sending essentially. I sometimes send text to people and sometimes they write to me saying, what's up? I have something for you. Like, you should get interested in that. Or did you hear that about this anecdote? And you're like, yeah, no, I did not hear about this anecdote. Maybe we should speak on the phone. I had one on the phone like a couple of days ago, and she was like, Thomas, you're not investigating on Frontex anymore. I miss you. Like, what's happening? Like, blah, blah, blah.
It sounds like sources can be very needy.
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act between building a relationship but also maintaining a professional boundary. So, the third and final tip is to have patience. So, both being patient in finding the right source to talk to and also spending time talking to this person over a period of time.
The right source isn't often going to be the first person I call. And, I think you just have to realize it might be the 10th person, or one person might refer you to another. So just, keep going down the roster of people to call.
And then once you get the right person on the line, being patient with how long it might take to get the information you need.
So I had multiple conversations with the source, two or three, before I asked the source the hardest question, or the question trying to get at the heart of the information I needed. Then, even after that question and conversation, I still didn't have the information I needed, and it took on a new process of having multiple conversations about this information, and checking in with each other, and having phone calls that sometimes didn't center on the investigation or information at all, before we built up a level of trust or comfort where finally we're able to move forward in the investigation and get connected to the information we need.
When you do source cultivation, you do need to waste time sometime on something that do not seems to be so relevant or so important, because the whole process is to make the people you're talking to actually give you more stuff, even though it's not relevant right now. There's no useless meeting. That's my point.
I guess all of this is to say that source building takes a lot of time and investment, but it's necessary when you're dealing with sensitive information. And I guess it gives context as to why some investigations take well over a year.
Yes, and for reporters like Thomas, he's constantly building new sources and new areas for investigations that he hasn't even conceived of yet. So it's really a game of extreme patience and being willing to invest in something that you know might pay off, even if it's like 2 or 3 years down the line.
You're listening to Backlight, Lighthouse Report's monthly deep dive into the elusive world of investigative journalism. If you want to know more about our investigations, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. Or if you have suggestions on who we can talk to on this podcast, you can reach out to us at backlight@lighthousereports.com.
So we shared some techniques on how to get sources to talk, and now to think about how you start building sources from scratch. Because Tamar has hundreds of people in his phone contact book. So when he's starting out on a topic, he already has some ideas of people he might text to find out more information. But how do you get yourself to that point if you're a journalist that's maybe just starting out, or you're looking at a new topic entirely? The first tip Tamar has is to build from your area of interest.
So, for instance, if I read a book of an author, a journalist, a scholar, something that feels interesting on the topic or because of the resources he had access to and so on, I'm always on the hunt, to speak to people. So that's what I do. I read his or her work, I let him or her know that it's interesting to me, and then convene to meet, to discuss informally. And then, sometimes it gives nothing. Sometimes there's a very immediate outcome. Like, sharing you some contacts, sharing you some materials, sharing you some new ideas, some expertise and so on. So yeah, I'm always looking for more people to contact, future work or current work or development of work that's been already published, essentially. So that's my way of thinking a bit. Yeah.
And another useful tool is LinkedIn.
That's a bit of technical advice to write to someone on its work email address, for instance. I always look for more informal way, that leave less trace, especially when you're speaking to law enforcement people or to people that can be subject of internal investigation and so on. So that's why I ended up using a lot LinkedIn at some point. And LinkedIn is also a good way to spot, some sources that seems interesting, because of their backgrounds, because of what information they have access to. And again, when you have a network of sources on the field, those people like kind of appear in your newsfeed from time to time.
Elena talked about how to use being someone in your early career to your advantage.
Something else I think is a limiting factor, that maybe you don't have as many clips, or your name isn't as well known. But that fact in itself, the fact that your name isn't plastered everywhere, actually makes you a really good person to do some of the harder reach outs.
Okay, and to wrap up the discussion, we wanted to reflect a little bit about safety and about how to stay safe when you're talking to sources, particularly those that might not necessarily be on your side or might be antagonistic to your reporting. And Thomas had some practical tips here.
There was a time actually where also I was meeting with a bike gang. I was very much into House and Joel's investigation at some point. And essentially, I also let a friend know that I was there, and he was supposed to call me 1 hour after I arrived to the places because it was at their headquarters. To also like, if I felt uncomfortable, being with all those guys with a lot of tattoo and so on, then I could, say that, oh, someone just called me or there's an emergency, I should leave. So I do not look like the person like being afraid or so on. I would have a safe way out, and that's some kind of strategy I sometimes use. So for instance, so my friend called me. He called me at like 1 hour after I arrived to the place. Was like, yeah, blah 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 blah, and I was like, no, it's fine, and yeah. But this is the kind of stuff that I try to set in motion in order not to be, unsafe. And I always arrive very early to meetings because I want to check like who's there, who's not there, have a look at the place.
Yeah, for example, when I'm on a reporting trip, I always have a point person in our team and I'm in contact with them. So then I'll do a check in during the morning and at night. And depending on what the work is, sometimes if I have to go meet a source late at night, then I'll always check in with this person. So, for example, when I went to Mozambique for the biometrics investigation, this was actually Thomas, and it helps a lot with feeling more at ease. And then obviously, there's a whole protocol that we have at Lighthouse. For example, we'll share our contacts of someone we're meeting, or we'll always share our schedule as well of that trip so that our colleagues can follow where we are, what we're doing. So we take as many precautionary steps, and that's probably the best way, especially if you're reporting from somewhere far.
Great to hear that you guys have a lot of practical precautions when you're on reporting trips. Okay, that's all for now. But to keep updated with our investigations, you can follow us on social media. We are currently all over social media. We have an Instagram, a TikTok, a Twitter, and a Blue Sky. And we actually have the same username at LH Reports on all of those accounts. You can also subscribe to our newsletter on our website, lighthousereports.com. And all of those accounts will be linked in the show notes.
Thanks to Spuvio for the sound editing, mixing, and design. And one final thing, if you're enjoying this podcast, feel free to subscribe and leave us a rating. It helps others to find the podcast too. And also send us a message. We'd love to hear from you.
Thanks, everyone.